All right, we are live. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the new lawsuit that has been filed against Facebook by the FTC. And they're saying, you know, uh, Facebook is a monopoly. We said that in the first initial trial, and we're saying that again, right? So if you remember from one of the previous videos that I did, I examined the question of whether Facebook is a monopoly. I talked about the action that's being taken by the FTC, and I talked about the result of that initial trial, where the judge kind of threw out the lawsuit, saying, "You haven't done your homework yet, right? You need to go back, dot the I's, connect the numbers, do whatever you have to do, but you haven't proven your case." So they went back. They have now filed a new lawsuit, and we're going to talk about that. And we're also going to talk about whether I still hold the same views from last time about whether Facebook is a monopoly or not. Okay, so let's first dig into the medium impression of this, because my channel is about unwinding the clickbait headlines and giving you proper perspective, historical perspective, and an economist perspective about news like this. And economics is at the heart of this question, as you'll see. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on. Okay, so as I said in the new complaint, the FTC provides more details to support the government's claim that Facebook holds a monopoly in social networking. Now, the public version of the suit has had many of the statistics redacted because the numbers are proprietary, right? So that's one question that comes up in our examination of the case, which is, Facebook is very secretive about the actual numbers, whether it's their algorithms or market share or how much real money that they're making. So um, first you might wonder, well, can we come to any reasonable, valid conclusions about the whole question about Facebook being a monopoly? And I'm going to say yes, and I'll explain the reasoning as we go along. But to delve further into the case that's being made here, right? So the core of the FTC's argument is that Facebook tried to maintain a monopoly over social networks through its acquisition of Instagram in 2012 and WhatsApp in 2014. It's slow to develop its apps for mobile phones. The company sought to buy or bury innovators, threatening to outcompete Facebook in the new mobile environment, according to the complaint by the agency. Right. So let's talk briefly about this. One of the observed behaviors of a monopoly is that instead of competing through innovation, and this is pretty standard, this is something that we observe not in every case, but in many types of monopolies, right? Because of the sheer market power that they have, they're able to buy out competitors that are a threat to their market share. In a sense, buying innovation, buying additional market share. And sometimes those innovations are buried in the companies of, in the companies of in the labs of the monopoly, right? Because it's easier sometimes to buy an innovation and make sure that it doesn't really see the light of day or it doesn't become popular, than rather it is than to actually change software or innovate their business model. So is that a problem for consumers? Yeah, it is. Right. This is the reason why the government sometimes feel justified in taking this action, because the role of the FTC is to encourage a free trade. Same thing with the SEC, right? So in the past, you probably had read in the history books about antitrust action. You know, um, so when a company gains too much market power and becomes anti-competitive in certain conditions, not all, right? And economists are not against every type of monopoly, right? But in many cases, the monopoly gains too much power, stifles innovation, and consumers are the losers in that result. So that's kind of setting the table for why this lawsuit is being brought. So to push on, let's take a look at a quick market share, right? I'm not going to get too much into the data in this live stream because in my previous analysis of Facebook, I discussed in more detail some of the economic theories. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and take a look. Um, yeah, like I said, I go in depth about market share and my analysis of free market transactions versus what happens under a monopoly. But looking at this market share, so what is this bar chart telling us? It's showing us the share of U.S. online consumers who use the following platforms on a regular basis. I think most people use Facebook and YouTube on a regular basis. From what I understand, YouTube is the most watched live stream platform on the earth, right? And Facebook itself is, huge, billions of users. I forget the exact number, but I mean, it's massive, right? And so when you look at these percentages, right, and these percentages are going to be important in the later part of the discussion. Um, 73% of online consumers use Facebook. They use YouTube. They use Facebook Messenger and Instagram. So Face um, owned by Facebook. I mean, Facebook is owned by Facebook, obviously, and then Facebook Messenger and Instagram. So YouTube is owned by Google, and there is some rivalry. There is some tension between those two companies. But look at the sheer market power that is held by Facebook itself, right? Three of the top four social media apps, right, depending on how you define them, are owned by Facebook. So on the sheer numbers, on the sheer face of it, right, it's a little hard, I would say even disingenuous to argue that Facebook doesn't have a dominating market share in the social uh, network space, right? So let's get further into the rationale for the lawsuit. So the lawsuit says that beginning in 2010, the company stifled competitors like Circle, a social network, and Vine, a short video platform, by adding new limits for how outside developers whose products connected to Facebook could work with their other social networks. Quoting, Facebook beat competitors not by improving its own product, but instead by imposing anti-competitive restrictions on developers, according to the lawsuit. Okay. Excuse me. Like I mentioned before, a lot of monopolies have been observed to stifle innovation, to swallow up smaller competitors because it's simply easier. They have the money to do this, right? Now, I think is a gray area in terms of should competitors be allowed to access Facebook as a platform itself, in terms of their APIs, application programming interfaces. I mean, um, I think that's a little bit of a gray area, but there's no question that Facebook bought, um, other smaller competitors, potential competitors in the social network space. And does that stifle innovation? Well, I suppose in a way it does, right? Because um, when you own over 50%, 60%, maybe even 70% of uh, the market share for social networking services, I mean, that's huge potential to earn income, right? And every company wants that, right? I'm not going to say that this is a weakness in terms of free market share because that's getting into a whole different conversation. But certainly, every profit-seeking private enterprise would like to expand its market share. Higher volume means more profit and more longevity, right? So, in that sense, Facebook is responding to the imperatives of a free market dynamic, right? And of course, once their market power and market share gets too big, depending on how you define that, I mean, you know, the government will intervene. And like I said, it's to protect the interests of potential consumers, right? So let's press on. Um, like I said, the original lawsuit was thrown out by the judge. It's in the District of Columbia, and I think it rightly notes that there is a huge challenge for regulators, right? And that is really going to be the heart of the discussion. How do regulators and agencies like the FTC prove that something is a a monopoly in something like social media, right? There are specific definitions defined by economists about what is a monopoly, but it may be possible, and I'm going to argue that those traditional definitions that have worked for decades, you know, um, are starting to become hazy. They're starting to become a little bit outdated, right? And I'm going to make my arguments toward the end when we talk about final thoughts, and I'll give you my conclusions and the takeaway, right? So, one thing that is coming up as a stumbling block for the regulators, for the feds, is that Facebook is quote unquote free. Now, I argued in the previous video that that is very misleading, and in fact, that is very dangerous to consumers. But in a very traditional official sense, right? Facebook is free. I don't pay a monthly subscription to use Facebook, and neither do you, right? Some of us actually might be willing to do that, but that's not the business model, right? And so, a lot of the analysis that's done in terms uh, of whether an entity is a monopoly and whether it is actually causing harm to the consumer is done by looking at the price, right? Because one of the biggest reasons why consumers and the government fears a monopoly is that because since they are the single source of whatever product, whatever sources, they have the potential to jack up prices to very high levels, right? But what happens when you're talking about a social network that offers its services, quote unquote, for free, right? How does that economic analysis extend itself? And that's really, I think, the question here, in the court, right? The judge is applying, according to his training, what is the traditional economic framework in terms of assessing the monopolistic behavior. But technology has moved ahead, right? And things are a little bit different now. So let's get further on into the rationale. Okay, so this is a quote from the judge himself. Now, let me expand the screen so you can read it. So, quoting from him, no one who hears the title of the 2010 film The Social Network wonders which company it is about, he said. Yet, whatever it may mean to the public, monopoly power is a term of art under federal law with a precise economic meaning. Now, keep that in mind. He is saying that there is a precise economic yardstick that has been traditionally applied under federal law, and he is saying that in his initial ruling, that by that yardstick, you haven't made the case. He's telling the FTC, you haven't provided enough details. You haven't provided a strong enough rationale to clear that hurdle, right? And so he instructed the FTC to back up claims that Facebook controls 60% of the market for personal social networking. That's in quotes, and that it blocked competition. Now, I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on what he's talking about. So, a lot of people who are, in fact, heavily involved in the usage of social media, I'm talking about you, the public, I myself, all my friends, I'm going to say 99% of my friends, we all use Facebook. And we know, all everybody uses Facebook, right? And the problem with social networks, or the characteristic that contributes to a kind of monopoly is that you have a chicken and egg problem, right? Everybody uses Facebook because everybody else is using Facebook, right? You know, when you try to get off of Facebook, and some of my friends have tried that, they went to other social networks. Guess what? There's nobody there. None of their friends are present in the smaller competitor networks. And so what happened? They came back to Facebook because that's where the action is, right? And so that kind of network interconnection in social media is something relatively new in economic analytical circles, right? Um, when we talk about, as economists, talk about a monopoly, we're talking about typically economies of scale or a natural monopoly where, for example, there is um, a mine, that provides some sort of metal that's not available anywhere else. Or, a classic example is Perrier water, the French water company. They say that, that water can only be, can be, uh, um, extracted from the ground by them. And so if you want to buy Perrier water, they're the only ones who can sell it to you. So it's a natural monopoly, right? But monopoly through the sheer weight of social interconnections is something I think that's relatively new and something to be discussed, something to be chewed over by economists, I think. And like I said, this points to the case that the traditional measures of monopoly, as applied by the federal courts, it's um, it's not quite meeting the challenge of the current day. That's my contention, right? And so uh, let's press on. So that's kind of the background, you know, um, into what's happening. So there was um, a useful article that I saw. Not every article out there is clickbait. I thought this one's actually quite good, and this is clearly written by somebody who has some knowledge of economics, and so it's talking about how the free market incentivized Facebook's harmful monopoly. Now, I want you to know right off the bat that I don't accept the surface premise of this article. They have an agenda here, right? They make some good points, which is why I'm going to bring that up. But I want you to know I'm not from from the start assuming that Facebook's monopoly is harmful. Well, I kind of do. In the previous video, um, I noted that there's a troubling aspect to Facebook's business model, right? But what I'm saying is a lot of people are talking about Facebook as a monopoly and that it's being harmful in some of the traditional ways that monopolies have been harmful to consumers in the past. I take a different perspective on that. And like I said, if you want to get more details about that, check out my previous video about Facebook as a monopoly. But anyways, so I did mention that, the free market itself has an incentive for companies to grow market share. That's pretty obvious. Everybody understands that market share equals profit. Profit means that you're doing your proper job as a free enterprise in a capitalist society, right? There's nothing wrong with that, right? Certainly, an economist would not say, that's a bad thing. Um, but the article is arguing here. I'm gonna first let me bring that up and make the argument. And it's really the same argument that I'm making about the tendency of social networks to grow and to continue growing because the rationale for their growth is the fact that they're growing, right? So it says what makes Facebook's monopoly natural is the organic tendency for any first mover in the social media market to become the dominant player when certain minimal conditions are met. In Facebook's case, those conditions include a culturally appropriate user interface. Not sure what that means by that. A user interface is a user interface. Hopefully it's easy. It's easy. A business model that maximizes profit extraction by way of exploiting users' personal data. Well, quite frankly, we know now that is what Facebook does, right? When we talk about exploiting users' data, it might sound harsh, but there was that documentary on Netflix about Facebook and social media and how they utilized our personal data. And I think in that particular instance, from based on what we've learned, exploitation is not really too strong a word for what's happening. And of course, to continue to quote the article, and the resulting unilateral manipulation of users' personal media experience. So they're talking about how the algorithm shapes your perception of the world um, to increase engagement. Facebook wants you to keep using Facebook and use more and more of Facebook, and so basically, it's going to show you things that conform to your likes. It will show you things that conform to your worldview, right? It's basically telling you what you want to hear, right? So that's their business model, okay? And so the article goes on. What Facebook has become not just a monopoly, but a natural monopoly. The company is, without a doubt, a monopoly. It possesses a predominant share in several subsectors of the consumer internet industry, be they social media, web-based text messaging, or photo sharing. That dominant share qualifies as monopoly in most major markets. And here's the part that's really important right here, because they're going to start talking about specific market share percentages. In the United States, the Federal Trade Commission has in the past suggested that firms with more than 50% market share could constitute a monopoly. In Europe, the lowest market share the European Commission has challenged for anti-competitive behaviors on the basis of monopoly power is 39.7%. Let's call it 40, right? So the numbers that are being thrown around, that's being quoted by this article, is basically that here in the United States, 50% is a meaningful threshold for the government. In Europe, the Commission says about 40% is a meaningful, market share, where we start to examine the question of whether any particular business is a monopoly. And keeping that in mind, here you go. Yeah. So you saw the percentages here. Now, this chart is not exactly the same thing as mapping out the percentage share of of social media platforms. This is the percentage of consumer who use these services, but it's not hard to infer that when one company, Facebook, owns three of the platforms, three of the top four social media platforms, right? Where one of them is 73%, the other two are basically hitting 50%. And remember, the threshold for the FTC is 50%. For the European Union, the commission there is looking at 40%. So um, it's clearly right up to the threshold or even beyond it. In fact, it's pretty obvious that it's going to be beyond it, right? So when you're talking about sheer nature of market share, right? Um, it's Facebook owns a lot. Okay, so I do want to give a little bit of the other side where Facebook responded by to this and really are saying, it all depends on how you define social media, right? A lot of the companies that are out there, like YouTube, it's not a personal social media. It's not sharing your personal data. There are a lot of companies out there that are only doing videos, that are only doing um, professional profiles like LinkedIn, right? And so the way that Facebook is responding to this lawsuit is by saying, we define our market share in a different way, right? So if you can't argue with the sheer size of your market share, well, you're going to try to redraw the boundaries of your industry so that you become a smaller component of that. It's all very jumbled, right? So all stuff is going to get worked out in the courts, and as an economist, I can't predict the actual legal probabilities and who's likely to win and who's not likely to win. Well, the truth of the matter is that the FTC has a low win percentage against companies because a lot of the companies that they go against have a lot of money. They hire a lot of lawyers. They have lobbyists, and the arm twisting that goes on behind doors with politicians. So the chances of Facebook, I think, surviving this lawsuit simply based on a review of past successes, I think is pretty high actually. But I'm not here to talk about the legality in that way, right? I'm here simply looking at it as an economist and saying, hey, what about market share? How do we define market share? And you know, um, well, is Facebook a monopoly? Okay, so let's press on. And so this is the final chart that I want to discuss with you, right? Um, so I know this is a little bit busy, and if you're not an economist, it might look a little intimidating, but let me take you through this real quickly, and I promise you that it's not as complicated as you might think, because the chart on the left right here, you probably have already heard about the supply and demand curve, right? If you're interested in this channel, chances are you have heard about it and you understand what that means. So, um, in a free market competition, right? Supply and demand reach an equilibrium point, right? The trades are settled by the price that is set, right? So, um, see this P here, right? This is the red line is supply, D is demand, and the place where they meet, right? Um, the price is set and says, okay, at this price, we're willing to trade. You want something, I've got a supply. I'm willing to sell it to you because this price is sufficient um, to satisfy both sides. Okay, that's I just understand. This is a monopoly chart, and the thing to really keep in mind is that there's only one demand. There is no supply. You know. Okay, so what does that mean, right? Well, it basically means that because um, a business like Facebook is, it could be a supply. I'm sorry, it could be a monopoly because if you want to use Facebook, there's only one Facebook, right? And so, in that sense, it can simply look at you and say, you know what, I'm going to charge you a certain price, and I know you can't go anywhere else, right? That's how monopolies work, right? Like the example with Perrier water. If you want Perrier water, you got to buy it from that company because no one else has it, right? Now, some people might respond, well, well then I'm out, right? If Facebook is charging a price that's too high, right? Well, then I simply won't use it. I'll go to Instagram. Oh, well, oops. Okay. Well, Instagram's owned by Facebook too, right? And then, you know, uh, what else? What else was owned by? Um, oh yeah, Messenger. I mean, you know, and so you start to get the gist of what it means for Facebook to be a monopoly because one, it's kind of hard to simply walk away and say, hey, you know what, I'm not going to use you anymore because there are alternatives, there are viable competitors, but the competitors are the products that might be viable as substitutes are also owned by Facebook, right? But the bigger problem that I pointed to in this video when I'm talking about the standard that the court is being applied is the fact that um, you saw in that. Okay, let me just bring that up. Uh, right here. The courts often look at whether prices are rising as an indication of monopolization, right? So basically, what they're saying is when a company achieves monopoly market power, they understand that, they realize that, and they start jacking up prices because where are you going to go, right? Now, traditionally, that has been a signaling effect to the government and saying, okay, well, hold on. Let's hit the brakes here because something is going on. We could be looking at monopolistic behavior, right? But look at this. Look at this right here. I mean, there is price, right? There is price in this monopoly chart. But remember what we were saying about Facebook. Their services are free, right? Or at least it appears to be free, right? And so if the federal courts, in particular that judge, is saying, you have to show me that prices are going up for me to be convinced that Facebook is a monopoly, how are the regulators supposed to do that? How is the FTC going to show not only that they have dominating market share, which I think that part is relatively straightforward, but that prices are rising when the services are free, right? That's the question that's being faced by the courts, and something that the regulators will have to argue, right? And in fact, that is the heart of the argument that I made in my previous video about Facebook being a monopoly. Okay, and that is the takeaway from this video, right? Um, uh, you know, um, Not only is it that Facebook cannot be adequately assessed by the traditional measures of monopolistic behavior that was used in the courts, but they hide their price, right? You know that there's a price. With Facebook and other social media, you are the product, right? Your personal data is the product, and you're giving that away for a price that you don't understand, right? So when you have a market transaction, okay, let's take a look at this again, right? In a free market transaction, right? Both the suppliers and the buyers understand the price. They know where it is. That's how supply and demand is being equalized, right? But with Facebook, you don't know. You don't know. I mean, so neither of these charts, the traditional um, measures or models of economic transactions, really apply to social media companies. And the standard that is currently being applied by the federal courts, it's really outdated, right? So this is a very interesting case for an economist to examine and kind of think about and say, okay, how is this going to work out? Not only in the legal sense, right, but also, what is the economic rationale that's going to prevail in the courts? And it's going to be interesting to see how all this works out, which is why I'm, doing these videos, kind of tracking the case and explaining what it all means to you. So I hope you found that useful, and I'll see you in the next video.